Part 6, The Flatlands, the Union Pacific's March West. The Union Pacific Railroad had a different set of challenges. The terrain was flat, the flatlands of Nebraska and Wyoming, but the weather was brutal, and the threat of Indian attack was constant. The workers had to cross rivers, canyons, and ravines, and they had to do it without the benefit of the mountains that protected the Central Pacific from competition. The Union Pacific workers were mostly Irish immigrants, men who had come to America to escape poverty and famine. They were tough, hard-drinking, and often violent. They lived in temporary towns, called Hell on Wheels, settlements that sprang up overnight and disappeared just as quickly, places of gambling, prostitution, and violence. The workers fought each other, fought the Indians, and fought the elements. But they kept going. The Union Pacific crews set records for track laying, sometimes laying as much as 5 miles of track in a single day. They built bridges across the rivers, viaducts across the canyons, and embankments across the marshes. They worked with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost superhuman. The Union Pacific also had to contend with the Indians. The Plains Indians, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, saw the railroad as an invasion of their homeland. They attacked the work camps, stole the horses and supplies, and killed the workers. The railroad responded with armed escorts and, eventually, with the U.S. Army. The Army fought a series of campaigns against the Indians, driving them off the plains and onto reservations. The cost was high, in lives, in money, and in the destruction of a way of life that had existed for centuries. The railroad was a symbol of progress, but it was also a symbol of conquest. Part 7, The Race. By 1868, the two railroads were racing toward each other. The Union Pacific, led by Grenville Dodge, was laying track across Wyoming, heading toward the Great Basin. The Central Pacific, led by Charles Crocker, was pushing through the mountains, heading toward the deserts of Nevada. The competition was fierce, a race not just for the glory of being first, but for the government subsidies that came with every mile of track laid. The Central Pacific was ahead, they had started earlier and had a head start. But the Union Pacific was gaining ground, and they were determined to catch up. The two companies engaged in a series of tactics and tricks, cutting corners on construction, buying up land ahead of the other, and even, in some cases, saboteuring the other's efforts. It was a race that had to be won at any cost. The engineers of both companies surveyed the terrain, searching for the most favorable route. The Union Pacific surveyors identified a pass through the Wasatch Range, and they began to build toward it. The Central Pacific surveyors found a route across the Nevada desert, and they built toward it. By the spring of 1869, the two railroads were within a few hundred miles of each other. The race was coming to an end. Part 8, The Promontory Summit. On May 10, 1869, the two railroads met at Promontory Summit, in the Utah Territory. It was a remote, windswept spot, a place that had been chosen as the meeting point for the two lines. The workers had been laying track at a frantic pace, trying to be the first to finish. The Central Pacific arrived first. Their workers, mostly Chinese, had laid the last rail and driven the last spike. They had won the race, but only by a few hours. The Union Pacific workers, mostly Irish, arrived shortly after, and the two crews celebrated together. The ceremony was brief but historic. Leland Stanford, the governor of California and the president of the Central Pacific, was present. Thomas Durant, the vice president of the Union Pacific, was also present. A crowd of dignitaries and workers had gathered to witness the event. Stanford drove the golden spike, a spike made of 17.6 karat gold, into the last rail. He was followed by Durant and other officials. The spike was driven home with a silver hammer, and the telegraph operator, standing nearby, sent the message to the nation, "Done." The news spread like wildfire. Across the country, bells rang, cannons were fired, and people celebrated. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete. Part 9, The Aftermath. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad was a transformative event in American history. It opened the West to settlement, commerce, and travel. It connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, making it possible to travel from New York to San Francisco in a matter of days, rather than months. It facilitated the growth of trade with Asia and allowed for the expansion of the American economy. But the railroad also had a dark side. It displaced Native Americans, destroyed their way of life, and contributed to the genocide of their peoples. It brought pollution and environmental destruction to the pristine landscapes of the West. It was built with the blood and sweat of thousands of workers, many of whom died in the process. The men who built the railroad were not heroes. They were businessmen, politicians, and laborers, human beings, flawed and contradictory. They built the railroad for profit, for power, and for glory. But they also built it for a vision of a united nation, a nation that spanned a continent, a nation that was bound together by iron and steam. Part 10, The Legacy. The Transcontinental Railroad changed the world. It was the first transportation network to span the North American continent, and it set the stage for the development of the American West. It facilitated the settlement of the plains, the growth of cities like Denver, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco, and the expansion of agriculture, mining, and industry. The railroad also created a new sense of national identity. It connected the East and the West, the old and the new, the settled and the frontier. It was a symbol of American progress and American ambition, a reminder that even the greatest challenges could be overcome. The golden spike that was driven at Promontory Summit is now housed in a museum at Stanford University. The silver hammer used to drive it is also preserved. The Promontory Summit itself is a National Historic Site, visited by thousands of people every year. But the true legacy of the Transcontinental Railroad is the nation it helped to create, a nation that stretched from sea to shining sea, a nation that was connected by iron and steam, a nation that was, in the words of Walt Whitman, tangled in the loves and hates of the race. Part 11, The Reflections. What can we learn from the story of the Transcontinental Railroad? First, the power of vision. The men who built the railroad were dreamers, men who saw a connection across a continent and were willing to risk everything to make it happen. They faced opposition, doubt, and ridicule, but they never gave up. Second, the power of labor. The railroad was built by the sweat and blood of thousands of workers, Irish, Chinese, African American, and white. Their work was dangerous, underpaid, and often unappreciated, but it made the railroad possible. Third, the power of technology. The railroad was made possible by the steam engine, the telegraph, and the explosive power of gunpowder and nitroglycerin. It was a triumph of engineering and technology, a reminder of what human ingenuity can achieve. Fourth, the power of connection. The railroad connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, bringing people, goods, and ideas together. It was a symbol of unity and progress, a reminder that even the greatest distances can be overcome. And finally, the power of history. The Transcontinental Railroad was not just a construction project, it was a transformation of the landscape, of the nation, and of the world. It was a reminder that history is not just about the past, it is about the present, and the future. Part 12, The Dream. Now, as you drift off to sleep, think about the Transcontinental Railroad. Imagine the surveyors, crossing the mountains and deserts, mapping the route that would change the world. Imagine the Chinese workers, hanging from ropes over the cliffs of the Sierra Nevada, drilling holes for explosives. Imagine the Irish workers, struggling through the blizzards of the plains, building bridges and trestles. Imagine the race, the two railroads, each pushing toward the other, each determined to be first. Imagine the Promontory Summit, the crowd of dignitaries, the golden spike, the message that was sent across the telegraph lines. Imagine the celebration, the bells ringing, the cannons firing, the nation united. And imagine the legacy, the cities that grew, the farms that were planted, the families that were built. Imagine the trains that carried goods and people across the continent, making the world smaller, more connected, more alive. Imagine the nation that was bound together by iron and steam. The Transcontinental Railroad is gone, but it is not forgotten. It lives on in the stories we tell, in the history we study, in the world we live in. It is a reminder that even the greatest challenges can be overcome, that even the most impossible dreams can come true. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, in your safe home, surrounded by the people you love, think about the Transcontinental Railroad. Think about the men and women who built it, who sacrificed, who dreamed. Think about the world they created, and the world we still live in. And remember that we are all part of the story they began, the story of human progress, human ambition, and human connection. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. And may your dreams be filled with the sound of steam whistles, the sight of golden spikes, and the hope of a world that is always being built anew. Good night. Alright, let's sleep. Pull the blankets up to your chin. Fluff your pillow. Turn off your phone and let the darkness settle around you like a soft, warm cloak. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time to a world that was being remade, a world of steam and steel, of sweat and gunpowder, of a nation that was healing from war and reaching for the stars. We're going to tell the story of the Transcontinental Railroad, the iron road that bound a continent together. But before we get to the golden spike and the driving of the last rail, we need to understand the world that made it possible, a world of pioneers and politicians, of fortune seekers and fugitives, of a vast, wild continent that was waiting to be tamed. Part 1, The Dream. The year is 1845. The place is Washington, D.C., the capital of a young nation that is still finding its feet. The United States is a country of ambition and contradiction, a republic that proclaims liberty while holding millions in slavery, a nation that stretches from the Atlantic to the Mississippi but has barely touched the lands beyond. To the west lies an empire of possibilities, gold, land, opportunity, and adventure. But between the settled east and the promised west lies a vast, empty space, 1,000 miles of prairie, desert, and mountain, a barrier that seems insurmountable. A young congressman from New York, Asa Whitney, stands before his colleagues and makes a proposal that seems absurd. He wants to build a railroad across the entire continent, from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. He calls it the Pacific Railroad. His colleagues laugh. It is impossible, they say. The distance is too great, the terrain too rugged, the cost too high. It will never be done. But Whitney does not give up. He travels across the country, giving speeches, writing pamphlets, and lobbying politicians. He argues that a transcontinental railroad would unite the nation, open the West to settlement, and create a trade route to Asia that would make the United States the wealthiest nation on earth. He is a man ahead of his time, and he is dismissed as a dreamer. But dreams have a way of coming true, especially in a country that was built on dreams. Part 2, The Visionaries. In 1853, the United States Congress authorized a survey of possible routes for a transcontinental railroad. 5 separate expeditions set out across the West, mapping the terrain, crossing the mountains, and charting the deserts. It was a staggering undertaking, a glimpse of what the railroad would one day make possible. The surveyors faced unimaginable hardships. They traveled by wagon, on horseback, and on foot, through territory that was largely unknown to the outside world. They crossed the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and the deserts of the Southwest. They encountered Native American tribes, some of whom were hostile, and all of whom were suspicious of the newcomers. They endured hunger, thirst, and the constant threat of violence. But they succeeded. By 1855, the surveys were complete, and the government had a clear picture of the terrain. The route was there, waiting to be built. The Civil War intervened, as it intervened in everything. The conflict over slavery consumed the nation, and the railroad was put on hold. But the war also created the conditions for the railroad's construction. The southern states, which had opposed the railroad, seceded from the Union. The northern states, which supported it, were now in control of the government. And the war had demonstrated the importance of a transcontinental railroad for national defense and unity. In 1862, in the midst of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act. It was a bold, visionary piece of legislation, one of the most important laws in American history. The act authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad and provided government subsidies to two private companies, the Union Pacific Railroad, which would build from the east, and the Central Pacific Railroad, which would build from the west. The race was on. Part 3, The Men, the Big Four. The men who built the Central Pacific Railroad were known as the Big Four: Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. They were a motley collection of merchants, businessmen, and opportunists who had come to California during the gold rush and had made their fortunes in the hardware business. Leland Stanford was the front man, a politician and businessman who would later become governor of California and founder of Stanford University. Collis Huntington was the driving force, a man of relentless ambition and questionable ethics. Mark Hopkins was the money man, a quiet, careful accountant who kept the books straight. Charles Crocker was the builder, a tough, no-nonsense manager who would oversee the construction. They were not engineers. They were not railroad men. They were businessmen who saw an opportunity, and they seized it. They formed the Central Pacific Railroad Company, and they won the contract to build the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. They were determined to succeed, even if it meant bending the rules. The Union Pacific Railroad was led by a different set of men, Thomas Durant, Grenville Dodge, and Oakes Ames. They were also businessmen, but they had political connections that gave them access to government contracts and subsidies. They were less scrupulous than the Big Four. They would create a dummy corporation, Credit Mobilier, to siphon off government funds and line their own pockets, but they were also effective builders. Part 4, The Labor, the Irish and the Chinese. The men who built the railroad were not the visionaries or the businessmen. They were the laborers, the men who swung the hammers, laid the rails, and drove the spikes. They were immigrants, mostly, Irish on the Union Pacific, Chinese on the Central Pacific. The Irish had been coming to America for decades, fleeing the Great Famine and seeking a better life. They were strong, hard-working, and desperate. They took the jobs that others didn't want, the dangerous jobs, the low-paying jobs, the jobs that could kill you. They worked on the Union Pacific, laying track across the flatlands of Nebraska and Wyoming, facing brutal winters and blistering summers, and the constant threat of Indian attack. The Chinese arrived later. The Central Pacific had initially hired white laborers, but they were unreliable. They would quit when the work got too hard or when they found better-paying jobs in the gold fields. Charles Crocker, the company's builder, decided to try Chinese laborers. He had been skeptical. He thought they were too small, too weak, and too timid. He was wrong. The Chinese workers proved to be the most reliable, the most hard-working, and the most dedicated laborers on the line. They were paid less than the white workers, and they were given the most dangerous jobs, including the work of blasting tunnels through the granite of the Sierra Nevada. They hung from ropes over sheer cliffs, drilling holes for explosives, while the rocks crumbled beneath their feet. Hundreds of them died in accidents, buried in avalanches or blown to pieces by premature explosions. But they kept working. They worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and they did it with a discipline and determination that astonished their employers. They became the backbone of the Central Pacific workforce, and they would be largely forgotten when the railroad was completed. Part 5, The Terrain, the Sierra Nevada. The Central Pacific Railroad had to cross the Sierra Nevada, a mountain range that rose from the California valleys to heights of over 7,000 feet. It was the greatest obstacle on the entire route, a wall of granite, snow, and ice that seemed impassable. The Chinese workers, under the direction of Charles Crocker, began the assault on the Sierra in 1865. They built a road along the mountain slopes, hauling supplies up by wagon and on their backs. They cut tunnels through the granite, using black powder and, later, nitroglycerin. They built trestles across the deep ravines and causeways across the marshes. The winter of 1866 to 1867 was one of the worst in recorded history. The snow fell in unprecedented quantities, burying the railroad and the work camps under drifts that were 20 feet deep. The workers dug tunnels through the snow, and they continued to work, even as the snow piled up around them. They hung canvas awnings over the track to keep the snow off, and they built shelters to protect themselves from the cold. One of the greatest challenges was the Summit Tunnel, which would carry the railroad through the crest of the Sierra. The tunnel was 1,659 feet long, and it was cut through solid granite. The workers drove a shaft from both ends and from the middle, working in shifts around the clock. They used picks, shovels, and explosives, and they did it by hand. The work was slow, tedious, and deadly. The workers were constantly at risk from cave-ins, rockfalls, and accidental explosions. But they kept going. On November 30, 1867, the tunnel was completed. It was a moment of triumph, a moment when the impossible had been made possible. The railroad was now over the mountains, and the Pacific Ocean was within reach.